suspension geometry and the Elmer method for dummies. That's what we're looking in this episode, or looking at in this episode of our er8, the tech series. We're not quite on episode 9, so this is like 8b or something like that. And yeah, while all the dumbasses are out in the stores buying toilet paper, yeah, let me explain this for you guys watching in the future. So you'll probably need to look on Wikipedia or something for the 2020 great toilet paper crisis or something like that, related to the China 19 virus. And yeah, you're going to have a lot of fun looking up that. So enjoy. And yeah, for all of you guys not watching this from the future, well, I mean, yeah, you're living it currently, so yeah, just go online and laugh at all the guys participating in that. But yeah, while other people are doing that, yeah, we can do some interesting stuff and move forward with our race car projects, and yeah, maybe help some of you guys out. So yeah, as you guys already know, last episode was episode 8, suspension geometry, and the Elmer method for doing suspension geometry. And I got a lot of feedback, and I mean, yeah, we also saw Elmer Racing on yeah, our YouTube page and Facebook page, and some on Twitter also. Yeah, lots of questions about how to actually implement this, and yeah, lots of complaints that, oh no, but roll center things are much better, and you have all these angles that need to be taken into consideration, and blah blah blah. And okay, of course, a lot of those complaints are just from people that don't want to change and don't really care about trying to figure out some new way. And of course, I mean, that's fine, and that's totally okay. But I'm not going to, yeah, waste time explaining to someone that doesn't want to be explained to. So yeah, those guys can work on whatever they want. But yeah, for the viewers of this series, that is not going to be concerning you at all. So you actually want to understand how this works. And I think a few people, yeah, I got some really good feedback and asked some specific questions, and I think are potentially already using this new method, so that seems really good. But I think I need to, yeah, go through some things with some not directly examples, because I don't want to go into details, because that can, yeah, create problems on actually figuring out how to use things and not being constrained by like previous thoughts or something like that. So it's kind of difficult to do that. But yeah, let's go through the Elmer method with some more in-depth explanations and sort of ideas about how to read the graphs and stuff like that. So let me just jump over here to this one. Yeah. So this is, yeah, as you saw from the last episode, I'll probably put a link in the video here somewhere on YouTube, so check that out if you haven't checked it out already. That explains what this is and what this does. But to do this very, very shortly, so this is basically the minimum information you need for a for a suspension system where you have steering and suspension travel in a wheel. So you have 6 degrees of freedom, and you need a full 2D map for all of these, so they're dependent on both bump and steering angle. This is the absolute minimum amount of information you can use to set up your suspension geometry. You can't use roll center or something like that. Roll center would be the equivalent of this sideways motion link with bump, and only at a single point. So you would have like, well, this is bad because the angle is completely wrong, so let's use this for a surrogate graph instead of this one. So you would get like the angle coefficient in one single point here, and you get one value and from one of these graphs, and then you still have 5 degrees of freedom left, and from this one graph you have like a single point value instead of the whole like area. So it should be, I mean, yeah, completely clear like why you can't use like a roll center height or something like that. Is just completely inadequate amount of information to be able to do any kind of design for your suspension geometry at all. But yeah, so let's start going through this stuff. We have some graphs to go through, and I'm not very efficient at going through stuff, so let's get going. Camber angle. First, this is one of the most important yeah, probably angles for the suspension geometry, and you want to maximize tire friction, so you want to for sideways forces, you want to well, yeah, if the sideways force is 0, then you have 0 sideways force, so that's always a sideways force to optimize camber angle for. So yeah, regardless of what kind of sideways force you have, you still want to optimize your camber angle for that. And yeah, so typically you would have with bump, so when the suspension is pressed into the car, so the car ride height goes down, then you want to increase in camber angle, so that's a negative camber angle for historical reasons. It's sort of the wrong way around with plus and minus, so but okay, I guess we're just stuck with that, kind of like electricity goes the wrong way, like why? No. But yeah, anyway, so you want to increase with camber angle with the suspension bump, and that is of course clear because you're going through a corner, so you have higher load on the outer wheel. Even without any body roll at all, the higher wheel loading means that you can run but the optimum tire friction will be at a higher camber angle and higher slip angle also. So yeah, when you compress the outer wheel, you want more camber, and on the inner side you have less load. And yeah, if you have a body roll also, which you typically always will have, then you need to take that in consideration also, because if you just have a 0 camber gain, then your wheels are just going to tilt over in the corner and you're going to lose camber instead of gain camber. So yeah, this is something that you need to look at. And I'm not sure if we're going to have enough pixels for this to show up in 1080p or not, but we have a bump is in this direction and rebound is in this direction. And you can see here the camber angle is the correct or the completely opposite angle for er8 car. So yeah, you're going to have people immediately complaining about this. But yeah, you need to go back and view the previous episodes. That would be, which episode would that be actually? Hold on just a second. Let me check that out. Suspension. Oh yeah, that's in episode 7. So yeah, go back and check out episode 7 on our suspension system. So we have a active ride height control on the car. So we're using that for anti-roll and also for tire compression compensation, and of course for suspension compression compensation also, so that we can run a constant spring rate during the entire lap and not need to run overly stiff suspension. And yeah, once we run that, so in a corner we have of course still a higher load on the outside tire, and I mean the physics of that doesn't change at all regardless of what kind of suspension setup you have. So the outer tire will compress more, and to compensate for that we need to move the suspension outwards. So even though we're compensating for the normally that increased load would compress the suspension also. Of course we're compensating that with active ride height. But in addition to that, we need to compensate for the tire compression. So once the tire compresses, we need to move the wheel outwards. So we need to rebound the outside wheel in the corner. And that rebound means so that when we're rebounding the tire, we need increased camber angle. So this is while we have this camber angle gain is completely opposite to what you would typically see in a circuit race car. And yeah, for other types of uses, you need different types of angles. So for optimum straight line performance, if you have a tire that is symmetrical, then you would want to run a 0 camber angle. So then you need to have a 0 camber angle gain over the suspension travel there. And yeah, so yeah, basic stuff. And yeah, of course, steering angle. So you have a steering angle coupling also to this, and depending on what kind of racing you're doing, what kind of tracks you're running at, what the speed is and stuff like that, you also want to look at what kind of, or I mean you need to look at that for all of these things, of course, obviously, but with this steering angle coupling also, so all of these are adjustable and tunable, and depending on what kind of suspension setup you have, like there will be compromises, like adjusting this will affect these like other graphs also, and you need to tune the system basically to get the overall best result. And yeah, of course, increase the degrees of freedoms for running a multi-link or like even more complex suspension geometries or suspension linkages can allow you to like tune specifically one thing without affecting anything else. So yeah, those are things to take into consideration also. But yeah, with this Elmer method, it doesn't matter at all what your suspension system is, or what kind of lengths of any rods, or yeah, what kind of angles any rods are at, or anything like that. It doesn't matter at all. Zero. The only thing that matters is what these curves turn into. So if you have a suspension setup that has a specific curve you want, then it's going to work yeah, as desired. It doesn't matter how you're achieving that curve, as long as this curve or this plane looks good, then that's everything that matters. So with vertical movement, so in this case we have a, what is it, pull rod setup, I think, in the front. So this is basically the how that pull rod affects this. So you can tune like non-linearities here and have like a progressive type things. So you can, so if you're running in a class or want to set up a car so that they have a progressive sort of spring rate and damper rate and the same thing, then this is a very, very easy way to do that with the coupling between bump and vertical movement on your suspension setup. Yeah, then we have a sideways motion. So this would be typically what the roll center stuff and things like this affects. So how much the contact patch moves sideways during bump and steering. And yeah, this is of course depending on what kind of racing you use. You will have lots of compromises with this. So if you're doing well, probably for street cars also, you want this to be almost zero sideways motion with bump, at least, because yeah, you have ruts and roads and stuff like that, and if you're going over a small crest or there's a bump or something, and your tires are going like sideways, and they're going to be going up and down in the ruts or something, and it's going to be really have a bad day driving that. And yeah, the same is for the rally cross stuff, where you have ruts in, yeah, or the like these wheel ruts, whatever they're called. I think they're called ruts. So where the tires typically would be, and then you're coming over a jump slightly sideways, and then you have like your wheel moving like 5 centimeters to the side or something, and that will like start affecting things hugely, because if the rut is like just about exactly the width of the tire, and you're like not wheelbase, but what is it? Well, whatever it is called, the width of the tires basically moves so that it doesn't fit into the rut anymore, then it's going to be incredibly unstable, like going up on either side, depending on how you're coming over a crest, like with like sideways force and stuff like that. So this is super important for high-speed circuit racing stuff where you have relatively flat surfaces. It doesn't matter that much, because the tire can move sideways. It doesn't really matter. Unless you're going over like curves very harshly under tire load, so you're like with your outside tire going over curves or something, or you have some really slow speed corner where you have like this round type like curves or something that you're riding over. So of course this will depend on how fast the suspension moves and how fast you're going with the car. So if the suspension is moving really quickly, so you have a large sharp bump and you're going relatively slowly with the car, that means that you're going to be inducing sideways. So even without ruts like producing sideways force on the side, sort of sidewalls of the tire, if you're moving the tire contact patch sideways quickly relatively to how fast it's going forward, then you're going to be inducing these sideways forces in the actual tire rubber, which is going to affect your cornering performance, and your upset the balance of the car, of course, also while it's like transitioning sideways. So that's why we have a zero bump response or zero bump coupling here to the sideways motion. So the tire can move upwards and downwards freely without having any kind of sideways motion at all. For the racing we're planning on running on the er8, it isn't super important, but we want to be able to really aggressively ride over curbs and stuff like this, which typically you don't see a high downforce cars being capable of doing. So just sort of showing off stuff and being able to run in different types of sort of courses and some tight corners and stuff like that. It should be beneficial. And also, yeah, because we have active ride height control that we're using for anti-roll, also it isn't really necessary to use this for anti-roll geometry in the suspension setup. And of course, yeah, as I just said, there are trade-offs with that. So, and yeah, and the sideways motion. So with the steering input, we do have a coupling to sideways motion, and that is to provide the driver with feedback to the steering wheel from how much g-forces or how much sideways force the tires are providing. So if you're going over a crest or something and the sideways, so the wheels offload a little bit, then the driver will immediately feel that in the steering wheel. So for drivers that are not that familiar, it will yeah, provide much needed but very helpful feedback. So something to think about also. For the toe angle, of course, yeah, you want the toe to change with the steering. That's how steering works. And yeah, depending on, so in multiple race categories, you probably want to have some kind of a coupling here between bump and toe also, so that because you're rolling into corners, then you want the steering angle to vary a little bit to help with that, so that you basically, when you're rotating the steering wheel into a corner, you don't get this. So if this is set up wrongly, then when the car rotates into the corner, either you need to apply more steering because the toe angle is reducing, or depending on how the tires, of course, respond also. But yeah, that's why you need to run full dynamic simulations, of course. And yeah, the other option is then if you're turning into the corner, and while the car rolls, it wants to turn more. So you first rotate into the corner, but even without losing traction, you need to like reduce steering angle. And of course, this is something that toe in and toe out will affect also. But this is, yeah, the toe coupling to a bump is something that will affect that also. That needs to be, yeah, of course, taken into consideration, and again over the whole bump and steering, of course, area, so that you don't end up having some like ear in one end or something where you have some huge nonlinearity that is going to cause huge problems that you then need to start tuning your dampers or compromising your diff setup or whatever to compensate for. So yeah, important stuff. Caster angle, so yeah, anti-dive geometry for front suspension. And caster angle, what else? I mean, yeah, for suspension setups where you have coupled caster angle to other things, so like McPherson setups or something like this, of course this will need to be compromised, of course, to get the other things set up properly. Or I mean, yeah, it also depends on what is going to be more important for the racing you do, which of these are more important and which of these you want to compromise to achieve other stuff you want. So for current WRC rally cars, for instance, you see a huge rebound travel in the suspension, and you have this sideways motion is really large in relation to a rebound also. And that's just simply because they're a constraint on what kind of suspension setup they can run. I'm assuming they have to run McPherson setup, because otherwise there would be no reason at all to run a McPherson setup. It's I mean, worse than a multi-link or A-arm suspension in every possible way. So, or maybe weight-wise, I'm not sure really, because the damper also needs to be much heavier in a McPherson setup. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe some WRC guys know, or I mean, yeah, if someone knows, then leave that information in the comments below, so that yeah, other people viewing this can get smarter also. That's important. Help each other out, guys. But yeah, so if you need a high suspension travel, and because of whatever regulation rules or setup rules or some other constraints, you might want to yeah, compromise on the sideway motions or something like that to be able to achieve that long suspension travel. And yeah, this is of course very true with caster angle, because it's not super important otherwise. But yeah, for anti-dive stuff, it's very easy because it's completely uncoupled from all the other stuff. So it's very easy to add anti-dive geometry for the brake calipers. So that's a very good thing to use caster angle for. And yeah, longitudinal motion. So this can also be used for anti-dive stuff. So if you have with the front suspension bumping, so that means moving inwards. If it also moves forward at the same time, then you have automatic anti-dive geometry. So when you have a backwards force on the front wheel, then that will want to push the front suspension outwards, and then yeah, tuning the angle you have there, you can tune the amount of anti-dive from that force also. So you can use both of these basically for anti-dive, and this of course works for anti-squat also for driven wheels, and for four-wheel drive cars also. Of course you will need to figure out what is the best compromise that you want from this overall setup. And yeah, again, longitudinal motion with steering input. This is something that you typically might want some kind of a coupling here, depending on your setup and how much of a coupling you want, and how much that affects the wheel size needed and stuff like this. But so for our setup, we have adjusted. Okay, now I wasn't prepared to say this, or I didn't really think this through, but longitudinal motion, yeah, and sideways motion is the other one that are relatively important for steering feedback. So yeah, when we have a steering input, we've tuned this to have a longitudinal motion, and but that needs to be in a sort of a relatively good relation to this sideways motion coupling with the steering input. So these will affect how the steering feels while you're turning into a corner and braking, for instance, on the front wheels. And we want to have a relatively high coupling here, because if you're yeah, going into the corner and you start locking your inner front wheel, for instance, then that will immediately affect or lower the braking force applied to that wheel, and then you will immediately feel that in the steering wheel. So the driver will have an easier time feeling what this sort of inner front wheel is doing when you have a steering connection with the longitudinal motion on the front wheel setup. But this of course can't be too strong relative to this sideways motion, because otherwise you're going to be having problems. Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to hear people complaining that but you can just compensate for that with power steering. No, you can't, because you can only like adjust the overall power level. If you have like two different forces that you need to be able to take into consideration, then you need to tune like how large they are in comparison to each other. With power steering, you can just like overcome larger forces, and of course there's an optimum sort of a torque level where you have the highest possible accuracy and there's sort of repeatability in the steering angle and feedback sort of sensory input sort of to the driver or something like that. So the higher the forces go, the less accurate information the driver is going to be getting from that steering feedback. Like for instance, if you start lifting something super heavy or something, you can like lift something heavier, and then you have like this like feedback trace, like okay, you're putting more effort in, and you can like feel that you're lifting more. But then at some point, like it just like flattens out, like you can't feel it anymore because your sensory input is already maxed out. But you can still like lift more, so you can so then you're like have like zero like information on how much force you're applying anymore, and it's not like this angled with like a flat corner, but you have like it's like a gradual input, and you have like a optimum area where you want the steering forces to be for the driver. So you need to yeah, tune of course power steering to have the steering forces in that area, and then you need to tune all the different steering forces that you want to be able to transmit it to the steering wheel, so that they're in a sort of good size or force range compared to each other, so that the steering feedbacks make sense, because otherwise yeah, the drivers that are not familiar with that are going to be confused, and it's either going to take a lot more laps to learn it, or it's just going to be completely horrible to drive or something. So yeah, lots of important stuff. I think that was most of it, and of course everything is subject to change, and depending on what kind of racing you do, or if you're building a street car or something, you will have completely different restrictions and completely different targets on what's important and what isn't, and what you want to do and stuff like that. So yeah, but this is a tool to use to figure out what to do. And this is only a tool, so you still need to run a full dynamic simulations to see how it actually works, and if your sort of assumptions on how this stuff is going to work with your tire flex, and how it's going to work with vehicle roll, and how your ABS system or whatever is going to work with that, with this whole package, then of course you need to check that separately with dynamic vehicle simulations. And yeah, I think that was it for this episode. So yeah, I'm Oscar from Elmer Racing, and this has been episode 8b of our er8 the Tech series on Elmer Method for Dummies. Bye. See you in the next one.